Blood stained the collar of her once white blouse as Penelope Norton stumbled into the small trading post at the edge of Wickenburg, Arizona Territory. 1883. The afternoon heat pressed down on the dusty town, but the whispers that followed her entrance into Forrester's general store were colder than a winter wind. She clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders despite the sweltering temperature, her eyes darting nervously between the sparse crowd of customers. "Water, please," she managed, her voice barely audible as she placed her last 3 pennies on the counter. Jacob Forrester, a man who'd seen his share of trouble in his 50-odd years running the only substantial store in this part of the Arizona Territory, nodded silently and filled a tin cup from the barrel behind him. His eyes never left the purple bruise blooming across her cheekbone or the way she winced when she reached for the cup. "Madam, you need more than water," he said quietly, sliding a cloth beside the cup. "On the house." Penelope's hand trembled as she pressed the cool cloth to her face. The relief was momentary, overshadowed by the knowledge that Thomas would be looking for her by now. Her husband's temper only worsened when he had to track her down. "I can't stay," she whispered, already backing toward the door. The trading post door swung open with such force it slammed against the wall. Silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun stood Frederick James, trail dust coating his denim pants and cotton shirt, his broad-brimmed hat casting shadows across features weathered by years under the relentless western sky. At 34, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his own strength and rarely had cause to prove it. "Forrester," he nodded to the shopkeeper, then stopped abruptly as he noticed the frightened woman shrinking back into the shadows. His eyes took in the bruising, the torn sleeve, and the way she seemed ready to bolt like a cornered deer. "Miss," he acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat, then moved to the counter as if to give her space. Penelope exhaled slowly. This stranger hadn't looked at her with pity or disgust, just a simple acknowledgement of her presence. Something in his calm demeanor made her hesitate at the door. "You new to Wickenburg?" Forrester asked Fred, though his eyes kept drifting to Penelope, passing through. "Looking for work with the Diamond Bar outfit," Fred replied, his voice low and measured. "Heard they're expanding their operation north of here." "Sam Butler's a fair man," Forrester confirmed. "Pays on time, works his men hard but treats them square." A commotion outside drew their attention-raised voices, the clatter of a wagon approaching too fast. Penelope's face drained of color. "That'll be Thomas," she whispered, backing against the wall. "I should have gone straight home." Fred turned slightly, observing her reaction without comment. Forrester sighed heavily, reaching beneath the counter where Penelope knew he kept a shotgun. "Mrs. Norton," Forrester said quietly, "you could go out the back way." Before she could move, the door burst open again. Thomas Norton stood there, face flushed with anger and liquor. At 37, he had once been considered handsome, but years of drinking and rage had hardened his features into something cruel. "There you are," he snarled, ignoring everyone else in the store. "I've been looking all over. What did I tell you about wandering off?" Penelope seemed to shrink further into herself. "I just needed some things for supper, liar," Thomas cut her off, striding toward her. "You've been gone for hours." Fred shifted slightly, placing himself between Thomas and the counter, not directly interfering but creating an obstacle nonetheless. It was a subtle move that didn't go unnoticed by Thomas. "This isn't your business, stranger," Thomas snapped. "Didn't say it was," Fred replied evenly. "Just waiting to make my purchases." Thomas glared at him, then turned back to his wife. "Come on, now." Penelope moved forward mechanically, eyes downcast. As she passed Fred, she stumbled slightly, and his hand instinctively reached out to steady her. Thomas saw the brief contact, and his face darkened further. "Get your hands off my wife," he growled. Fred slowly released Penelope's arm. "No harm intended." "Thomas, please," Penelope whispered. "Let's just go home." But Thomas was already advancing, emboldened by alcohol and an audience. "You looking at my wife, Cowboy? Think I don't see what's happening here? Fred remained still, his posture relaxed but alert. Nothing's happening here except you making a scene in Mr. Forrester's establishment. The store had grown silent, the few other customers watching with the wary attention of people who recognized a dangerous situation unfolding. Thomas jabbed a finger into Fred's chest. I know you're kind, drifting through thinking you can take whatever catches your eye. Thomas. Penelope's voice was sharper now, fear for the stranger overriding her own. He was just being polite. Please, can we go? Thomas grabbed her arm roughly, causing her to gasp in pain. We're going, all right. Fred's eyes narrowed slightly at the sound of her pain, but he made no move. Forrester cleared his throat loudly. Norton, you still owe me for last month's credit, the shopkeeper said, clearly trying to defuse the situation. Maybe settle up before you go, Thomas scowled but released Penelope's arm to dig in his pocket. Fine, how much? As Thomas turned toward the counter, Penelope's eyes met Fred's for the briefest moment. What he saw there, desperation, resignation, a flicker of something that might once have been hope, made him break his own rule about staying out of other people's troubles. Madam, he said quietly. You all right? Thomas whirled back around. She's fine. Ain't you, Penny? Penelope's lips parted, then closed. She nodded automatically. Fred studied her for a long moment, then addressed Thomas. Seems to me a man ought to take better care of what's his. What did you say? Thomas took a step closer. Said a man ought to treat his possessions with care, Fred replied, his tone still conversational. Horse, gun, or wife, treat 'em rough and they'll all fail you when you need 'em most. The comparison wasn't lost on anyone in the room, least of all Thomas, whose face flushed dark with rage. You comparing my wife to a horse? He demanded, hands curling into fists. Fred shrugged. Just making an observation about proper care. Thomas lunged forward, swinging wildly. Fred sidestepped easily, making no move to counterattack. The other man stumbled, thrown off balance by the missed punch and his own inebriation. Thomas, stop it! Penelope cried, moving forward to grab her husband's arm. With a snarl, Thomas shoved her away. She crashed into a display of canned goods, sending them clattering to the floor. The sound of metal cans rolling across wooden planks seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Fred's expression changed then, something cold settling over his features. When Thomas turned back to him, fists raised, the cowboy moved with startling speed. One moment Thomas was preparing to charge, the next he was pinned against the counter, Fred's forearm across his throat. A man who raises his hand to a woman, Fred said quietly, ain't much of a man at all. She's my wife, Thomas choked out. My business, Fred increased the pressure slightly. That's where you're wrong. A wife isn't property, she's a trust. He released Thomas suddenly and stepped back. Thomas sagged against the counter, gasping and glaring. You'll regret this, he wheezed. Sheriff Carter's my friend. He'll run you out of town before sundown. Maybe, Fred acknowledged, but right now I think you should leave, alone. Thomas straightened, his eyes darting between Fred Forrester, whose hand was still beneath the counter, and the other customers watching the scene unfold. Whatever he saw convinced him this wasn't a battle to fight now. Fine, he spat. Penny, I'll see you at home. It was a threat, not a statement, and everyone knew it. No, Penelope said suddenly, her voice small but clear. No, Thomas, I'm not coming home. The silence in the store grew deeper. Thomas stared at his wife as if she'd grown a second head. What did you say to me? He demanded. Penelope was trembling, but she stood straighter. I said I'm not coming home, not today, not ever again. Thomas laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Don't be ridiculous. Where would you go? Who would take you in? You've got nothing and nobody. The cruel words hung in the air. Penelope's momentary courage seemed to waver, her eyes dropping to the floor. She's got options, Fred said quietly. Diamond Bar's looking for a cook at their main house. Pays fair, includes room and board. Penelope's head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise. Thomas glared at Fred with pure hatred. You've got this all planned out, don't you? My wife leaves me for a job you just happen to know about. Coincidence, Fred replied, but a fortunate one for the lady. Thomas took a menacing step toward Penelope. "You aren't going anywhere." Fred moved again, placing himself between them. "She is. Your choice is whether you walk out that door now or get dragged out." For a tense moment, it seemed Thomas would choose the harder path. Then Forrester cocked his shotgun, the sound cutting through the silence. "Norton," the shopkeeper said firmly, "time for you to go." Thomas's jaw worked as he looked around the room, taking in the unsympathetic faces. Finally, he spat on the floor. Fine, she was never worth the trouble anyway. He directed his final words at Penelope. "You'll be back. When you're hungry and cold and realize no decent man wants another man's leavings, you'll come crawling back." With that, he stormed out, the door banging shut behind him. No one moved for several seconds, as if waiting to be sure he was truly gone. Finally, Penelope sank onto a nearby barrel, her legs no longer able to support her. Her hands covered her face as her shoulders began to shake. "I can't believe I said that," she whispered through her fingers. "Where am I going to go? What am I going to do?" Fred exchanged a look with Forrester, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Norton," Fred said carefully, keeping his distance. "I wasn't lying about the Diamond Bar. They are looking for someone to cook for the ranch hands. It's honest work." She lowered her hands, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and wary eyes. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Fred considered this, then answered simply. "My ma raised me to believe there are times a man has to step in and times he needs to step back. This seemed like the stepping in kind." "He'll come after me," she said, her voice hollow. "Thomas doesn't let go of what he considers his." "The Diamond Bar is 20 miles north," Forrester interjected. "Sam Butler doesn't tolerate trouble on his property, and he's got enough hands to back that up." Hope and fear battled across Penelope's face. I don't have any way to get there, no money for stage fare." "I'm heading that way," Fred said. "I can take you." She studied him, trying to determine if there was some hidden motive behind his offer. "Why would you do that?" "Like I said, they need a cook. I need a job. Makes sense to arrive together." He paused, then added, "I give you my word, madam, no harm will come to you under my watch." Penelope looked to Forrester, who had known her since she arrived in Wickenburg 3 years earlier as a new bride. "Jacob?" she asked softly. The older man sighed. "Penny, in all the years I've known Thomas, he's never shown any sign of changing. It'll only get worse." He gestured to her bruised face. "Next time might be your last." His words hung heavy in the air. Everyone present knew he spoke the truth. They'd seen it happen before to other women. "I have a wagon out back," Forrester continued. "It ain't much, but it'll get you to the Diamond Bar. Fred can drive. Bring it back next time he's in town." Fred nodded. "We should leave soon, before Norton has time to round up his friends or sober up enough to follow." Reality was setting in for Penelope. She looked around wildly. "But my things?" "What do you need that can't wait?" Fred asked practically. She thought about their small cabin on the edge of town. What was there worth returning for? A few dresses, a hairbrush that had been her mother's, a photograph of her parents. "Nothing that's worth my life," she finally admitted. "Mr. Forrester can extend you credit for necessities," Fred suggested, looking to the shopkeeper for confirmation. "Course I can," Forrester agreed. "You've always paid your debts, Penny, unlike some." For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched Penelope's lips. "Thank you, Jacob, for everything." As Forrester began gathering supplies, a change of clothes, basic toiletries, food for the journey, Penelope turned to Fred. "You never told me your name," she said quietly. "Frederick James," he replied with a slight nod. "Most folks call me Fred." "I'm Penelope Norton," she hesitated. "Though I suppose I'd rather not be Norton anymore." "What was your name before?" he asked. "Newell, Penelope Newell." Fred nodded. "Miss Newell, then. We'll be leaving within the hour." As he moved to help Forrester load supplies, Penelope touched his arm lightly. "Mr. James." He paused, looking down at her hand on his sleeve before meeting her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, his expression softened slightly. "No need for thanks, just doing what needs doing." "All the same," she insisted, "I won't forget this." Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise at her sincerity, or maybe recognition of the courage it had taken for her to stand up to Thomas. "Get yourself ready, Miss Newell," he said gently. "We've got a long road ahead." Within the hour, they were headed north out of Wickenburg, the town receding behind them as the vast Arizona landscape opened up before them. Penelope sat stiffly beside Fred on the wagon seat, her few new possessions packed in a small bundle behind them. Neither spoke for the first few miles, each lost in their own thoughts. The rhythmic creaking of the wagon and the steady plodding of the horses created a soothing backdrop to the wild beauty surrounding them, red rocks rising from the desert floor, saguaro cacti standing like sentinels against the darkening sky. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the landscape in gold and crimson, Penelope finally broke the silence. "My husband beat me," she said, her voice so low he almost missed it beneath the wagon's noise. Fred didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead, giving her the privacy of not seeing her face as she spoke. "Then you'll heal where no man raises a hand," he replied simply. The promise in those words washed over her like a cooling breeze. For the first time in years, Penelope felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope. As darkness fell, Fred guided the wagon off the main trail to a small clearing sheltered by a stand of mesquite trees. "We'll camp here tonight," he announced, bringing the horses to a stop. "Continue at first light." Penelope looked around nervously. She had never spent a night outdoors before. Thomas had kept her close to home, rarely allowing her to venture beyond Wickenburg's limits. "Is it safe?" she asked, scanning the darkness beyond their small clearing. "Safe enough," Fred replied, jumping down from the wagon. "Few travelers on this route, and we're far enough from town that Norton won't find us, even if he tried." He extended a hand to help her down, but Penelope hesitated, suddenly acutely aware of her situation alone in the wilderness with a man she'd met only hours ago. As if reading her thoughts, Fred lowered his hand. "I'll sleep under the wagon," he said matter-of-factly. "You can take the wagon bed." "I've got blankets." Relief and embarrassment warred within her. "I didn't mean to suggest. You've got no cause to trust any man right now," Fred interrupted gently. "No offense taken." As he busied himself setting up camp, gathering wood for a small fire, tending to the horses, arranging her sleeping place in the wagon bed, Penelope watched him with growing curiosity. His movements were efficient, practiced, speaking of years spent on the trail. Yet there was a gentleness to him that contradicted his weathered exterior, evident in how he spoke softly to the horses and carefully prepared a space for her comfort before seeing to his own. "Have you always been a cowhand?" she asked as he heated coffee over the small fire. Fred glanced up, seeming surprised by her interest. "Since I was 15. Started as a wrangler for a cattle drive heading to Dodge City, been moving ever since." "Never settled anywhere," he shrugged. "Never found a reason to, no family." As soon as the words left her mouth, Penelope regretted the personal nature of the question. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business. It's all right." Fred poured coffee into 2 tin cups, passing one to her. "Parents died when I was young. Raised by my grandmother until she passed when I was 14. Been on my own since." The simple statement of facts held a lifetime of loneliness that Penelope recognized all too well. She had been orphaned young too, raised by a strict aunt who had been all too eager to marry her off to Thomas when he came calling. "Do you ever get tired of it, moving all the time?" Fred stared into the fire, considering her question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but the country's big. Always something new over the next ridge." "I've never been anywhere," Penelope said softly. "Grew up in Prescott, married Thomas at 18, moved to Wickenburg. That's the sum of my worldly experience." "You're young yet," Fred observed. "Plenty of time." "I'm 21, she said, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "Not so young." The corner of Fred's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "From where I'm sitting, that's plenty young. And how old are you, Mr. James, to be so worldly wise?" 34 next month, he replied. They fell into silence again, sipping their coffee as the fire crackled between them. The night sounds of the desert created a symphony around them, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the mesquite. "Will they really hire me?" Penelope asked eventually, her voice small. "At the Diamond Bar," Fred nodded. "The previous cook left 2 weeks ago. Ranch hands are getting tired of their own cooking. Heard them talking about it in town last week before I headed to Wickenburg. But I don't know anything about cooking for cowboys. I barely managed to cook for Thomas." Fred studied her across the firelight. "Can you make biscuits?" "Yes. Beans, of course." "Then you already know more than most of the boys trying to feed themselves." He set his empty cup aside. "Ranch hands aren't particular, Miss Newell. They just want food that's hot and plenty of it." "Please," she said suddenly, "call me Penelope or Penny if you prefer. After today, Miss Newell sounds strange to my ears." Fred nodded. "Penelope, then." The way he said her name, each syllable given its due, made it sound different somehow. Not the harsh Penny that Thomas barked when he wanted something, but something more dignified. "We should get some rest," Fred said, rising to bank the fire. "Long day tomorrow." As promised, he prepared a comfortable spot for her in the wagon bed, with blankets arranged to provide some cushion against the hard wooden boards. When she was settled, he took his own blanket and disappeared beneath the wagon without further conversation. Penelope lay awake for a long time, staring up at the star-filled sky. It was the first time in 3 years she had gone to sleep without fear knotting her stomach, without listening for Thomas's heavy footsteps and trying to gauge his mood. The bruises on her body still ached, but for the first time she could imagine a day when new ones wouldn't replace the old. "Thank you," she whispered to the night, not sure if her gratitude was directed at Fred or God, or simply the vast Arizona sky that suddenly seemed full of possibilities instead of limits. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising another scorching day. Penelope woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet sounds of Fred preparing breakfast salt pork, sizzling in a small pan over the rekindled fire. For a moment, disorientation washed over her. Then memory returned: Thomas, the store, her declaration of independence, and this journey with a stranger who had stepped into her life at precisely the right moment. She sat up quickly, wincing as her bruised ribs protested the movement. "Morning," Fred called, not looking up from his cooking. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Penelope climbed carefully from the wagon, suddenly conscious of her rumpled appearance. She had slept in her clothes, and her hair, normally pinned meticulously according to Thomas's preferences, had come loose during the night. She attempted to smooth it with her hands before approaching the fire. "I must look a fright," she murmured, accepting the cup he offered. Fred glanced up briefly. "Seen worse," he replied, the corner of his mouth twitching again in that almost smile. "Beans'll be ready soon." They ate a simple breakfast in companionable silence as the sun rose higher. Afterward, Fred efficiently broke camp while Penelope washed their few dishes in water from the canteen. "How much farther to the Diamond Bar?" she asked as they set out again, the wagon creaking beneath them. "Should make it by mid-afternoon if the trail stays good," Fred replied, flicking the reins gently to urge the horses forward. As they traveled, the landscape gradually changed. The stark desert gave way to grassland dotted with juniper and pine as they gained elevation. Penelope found herself relaxing, taking pleasure in the journey itself, something she hadn't experienced since childhood. "It's beautiful," she said softly, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. Fred followed her gaze. "This is good country," he agreed. "Rich grazing land, plenty of water compared to down south. That's why the Diamond Bar's doing well." "Have you worked there before?" He shook his head. "No, but I know of them by reputation." Sam Butler started with nothing 20 years ago, built it into one of the biggest spreads in the territory. "Fair man, from what I hear." "And his wife?" Penelope asked, the question that had been foremost in her mind finally surfacing. "What kind of woman is she?" Fred glanced at her, understanding her concern. Margaret Butler's respected throughout the territory, works alongside her husband in running the ranch. They lost their only son in the war, so they treat their hands almost like family. Relief washed over Penelope. A good woman as the ranch mistress might mean understanding, perhaps even protection if Thomas came looking for her. And you really think they'll hire me? A woman with no recommendations running from her husband. They need a cook, Fred said simply, and from what I've seen, you've got courage. That counts for something with folks like the Butlers. His assessment courage struck Penelope as wildly inaccurate. Courage? I stayed with a man who beat me for 3 years. I only left because you happened to be there. Fred was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Way I see it, he finally said. Staying took one kind of courage, facing each day, enduring. Leaving took another kind. Both count. His perspective startled her. Penelope had never considered her endurance as courage, only as weakness, an inability to take action. Before she could respond, Fred pointed ahead. See that ridge line? Diamond bars just beyond it. We'll be there within the hour. Sure enough, as they crested the ridge, a valley opened up before them. Nestled against the far hillside was a collection of buildings, a large main house, several bunkhouses, barns, and corrals. Cattle dotted the valley floor, and in the distance, riders moved among the herd. It's bigger than I imagined, Penelope breathed, suddenly intimidated. Runs about 2,000 head, Fred confirmed. 40 hands during the busy season, 40 men. The prospect of cooking for so many was daunting. Not all at once, Fred assured her. Most are out with the herds. You'd be feeding maybe 15 to 20 at the main ranch plus the Butlers. As they approached the ranch, activity around the buildings became visible. Men moved between corrals. A wagon was being unloaded near one of the barns, and smoke rose from the chimney of what must have been the cookhouse. Fred guided their wagon toward the main house, a substantial 2-story structure built of local stone and timber. Before they reached it, a man on horseback intercepted them, riding out from the nearest corral. "Help you folks," he called, his hand resting casually near the pistol on his hip. "Looking for Sam Butler," Fred replied. "Heard he might be hiring." The man, perhaps in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair beneath his hat, studied them carefully. His eyes lingered on Penelope's still visible bruises before returning to Fred. "Sam's up at the north pasture," he said finally. "I'm his foreman, Bill Mackenzie. What kind of work you looking for?" "Cowhanding for me," Fred answered. "And the lady's a cook." Mackenzie's eyebrows rose slightly. "Cook, you say?" He addressed Penelope directly. "You ever cooked for a ranch before, madam?" "No, sir," she admitted, "but I'm a quick learner and hard worker." Mackenzie scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, we surely do need someone in that kitchen. Boys are about ready to mutiny over Hank's cooking." He jerked his thumb toward the cookhouse. "Man can wrangle cattle but can't tell salt from sugar." A woman's voice called from the direction of the main house. "Bill, who's that you're talking to?" They turned to see a woman approaching, tall, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, her dress simple but well-made. Despite being in her 60s, Margaret Butler moved with the energy of a much younger woman. "Travelers looking for work, Mrs. Butler," Mackenzie explained. "This one claims to be a cook." He nodded toward Penelope. Margaret Butler studied Penelope with keen eyes that missed nothing, not the fading bruises, the mended tear in her sleeve, nor the wary posture that spoke of recent trauma. "Come down from the wagon, child," she said, her tone gentler than her searching gaze. "Let's talk inside." Fred helped Penelope down, then nodded respectfully to Mrs. Butler. "Frederick James, madam. I can wait out here while you ladies talk." "Nonsense," Margaret replied briskly. "You both look like you could use a proper meal. Bill, have someone see to their horses, then join us in the house." It wasn't a request, and Mackenzie didn't treat it as one. "Yes, madam," he responded, already signaling to one of the hands nearby. Margaret led them toward the main house, her back straight as a ramrod. "I'm Margaret Butler," she said over her shoulder. "My husband's away at the moment, but he trusts my judgment in household matters. The interior of the Butler home was comfortable without being ostentatious polished wood floors covered with woven rugs, solid furniture built for use rather than show, and walls adorned with a few quality paintings among family photographs. It spoke of prosperity earned through work rather than inherited privilege. Margaret showed them into a spacious kitchen at the rear of the house, where she instructed them to sit at a large oak table while she poured coffee and cut slices from a fresh baked pie. "Now," she said, once they were settled with food before them, "I suspect there's more to your story than two travelers happening by looking for work." Her eyes lingered on Penelope's bruises again. "Young woman, would you care to tell me what brings you here?" The directness of the question caught Penelope off guard. She glanced at Fred, who nodded slightly in encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Penelope looked directly at Margaret Butler. "My name is Penelope Newell. Until yesterday, I was Penelope Norton, wife to Thomas Norton of Wickenburg." She paused, gathering courage. "I left him because he beat me, regularly. Mr. James helped me escape and mentioned you might need a cook." If Margaret was shocked by this blunt confession, she didn't show it. "I see," she said, studying Penelope thoughtfully. "And you, Mr. James. What's your part in this?" Fred set down his coffee cup. "Was in the right place at the wrong time, or maybe the wrong place at the right time. Either way, she needed help." "You knew each other before yesterday?" Margaret pressed. "No, madam," they answered in unison. Margaret's gaze sharpened. "So you left your husband and traveled alone with a stranger. That was quite a risk, Mrs. Norton." "Miss Newell," Penelope corrected firmly. "And yes, it was a risk, but Mr. James has been a gentleman and staying with Thomas was certain death sooner or later." Something in Margaret's expression softened. "Well, Miss Newell, as it happens, we are indeed in desperate need of someone who can cook. Our previous man left without notice and the results have been unfortunate." As if on cue, Bill Mackenzie entered the kitchen, removing his hat as he came. "Mrs. Butler, I've had the hands put their wagon in the carriage house for now." "Thank you, Bill," Margaret replied. "What do you think of our prospective cook?" Mackenzie glanced at Penelope. "Can't say, madam, not having tasted her cooking. But if she can manage better than Hank, the boys would be grateful." "And Mr. James here? We need another hand." Mackenzie assessed Fred with the practiced eye of a man who had hired dozens of cowboys over the years. "Could use another experienced man for the North Range, if he knows cattle." "Been working cattle since I was 15, Fred confirmed. "Most recently with the Bar X out of Wyoming, before that with Simmons' outfit in Colorado," Mackenzie nodded. "Sam will want to talk to you himself, but I don't see a problem if your references check out." "They will," Fred said simply. Margaret seemed to come to a decision. "Very well. Miss Newell, I propose a trial arrangement. You'll take charge of the cookhouse immediately. If after 2 weeks your cooking meets with approval, we'll discuss permanent terms." She turned to Fred. "Mr. James, you can start with the morning crew tomorrow. Bill will show you the bunkhouse." Relief washed over Penelope's face. "Thank you, Mrs. Butler. I won't disappoint you." "See that you don't," Margaret replied, but there was kindness beneath the brisk tone. "Now, Bill will show Mr. James to the men's quarters, and I'll take you to the cookhouse. You can start by preparing supper for the hands returning this evening." As they rose from the table, Margaret added, "One more thing. Should your husband come looking for you and men like that often do, you'll be under the protection of the Diamond Bar. Sam doesn't tolerate trouble on our land." Penelope blinked back sudden tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "Cook a decent meal," Margaret answered practically. "That will be thanks enough. The men around here are near to revolt over the current situation." With that, they parted ways, Fred following Mackenzie toward the bunkhouses, and Penelope accompanying Margaret to what would become her new domain. The cookhouse was a large, separate building situated between the main house and the bunkhouses. Inside was a spacious kitchen with a massive iron stove, several work tables, a pump for fresh water, and shelves stocked with supplies. Adjacent was a dining area with long tables and benches that could accommodate at least 20 men at a time. Breakfast is at 5:30, Margaret explained, showing Penelope around. Dinner at noon for whoever's on the main property and supper at 6. The men work hard and eat accordingly, so portions need to be generous. Penelope took it all in, feeling both overwhelmed and strangely excited by the challenge. This kitchen was 3 times the size of the tiny cooking space she'd had in the cabin with Thomas. "Where will I sleep?" she asked, suddenly realizing this practical detail hadn't been addressed. Margaret pointed to a door at the rear of the kitchen. "There's a small room back there for the cook. It's simple but private. I'll have one of the women bring fresh bedding." After Margaret left, Penelope stood alone in the quiet kitchen, trying to absorb the rapid changes in her life. Just 24 hours earlier, she had been in Wickenburg, enduring another day of Thomas's temper. Now she was 20 miles away with a new job, a new place to live, and the first real chance at independence she'd ever had. She ran her hand along the worn but clean surface of the main work table, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. This was her domain now, her chance to prove herself. With renewed determination, Penelope rolled up her sleeves and began exploring the pantry, mentally planning the evening meal. Meanwhile, Fred was being shown to the bunkhouse by Mackenzie. The long, low building was simple but well-maintained, with 2 rows of bunks, a central stove for heat, and personal items of the current occupants neatly stored in trunks or on shelves near their beds. "You can take that one in the corner," Mackenzie said, pointing to an empty bunk. "Most of the boys are decent enough, though like anywhere, we've got a few troublemakers. Keep to yourself until you get the lay of things." Fred nodded, setting his saddlebags on the indicated bunk. "Fair enough." Mackenzie studied him thoughtfully. "That girl's story true, husband beat her." "True enough," Fred confirmed, his expression hardening slightly. "Saw him do it myself," Mackenzie grunted. "Bastard, Mrs. Butler will look after her. She's got a soft spot for strays, though she'd never admit it." He paused, then added with deliberate casualness, "You and the lady." "There's something there I should know about," Fred met his gaze steadily. "Just helping someone who needed it, nothing more." "Good," Mackenzie nodded. "Ranch has rules about men visiting the cookhouse after hours. Mrs. Butler runs a tight ship. Won't be a problem," Fred assured him. With that understanding established, Mackenzie showed Fred around the rest of the ranch, the stables, corrals, equipment barn, and finally the remuda where the working horses were kept. "You'll be assigned mounts tomorrow," Mackenzie explained. "For now, get settled in. Supper's at 6 in the cookhouse. Sam should be back by then to meet you." As the day progressed, Penelope threw herself into preparing her first meal for the Diamond Bar hands. The pantry was well stocked, if somewhat disorganized, and she found everything she needed to make a hearty beef stew, cornbread, and apple cobbler for dessert. As she worked chopping, searing, stirring, she felt a growing sense of confidence. This, at least, was something she knew how to do. Thomas might have criticized her cooking regularly, but it had been one of the few skills her aunt had thoroughly taught her. Just before 6, as she was placing the last of the corn bread on the tables, men began filing into the dining area. They entered noisily, laughing and talking among themselves, but fell silent when they saw Penelope standing nervously by the stove. One by one, they removed their hats, exchanging confused glances until Mackenzie entered behind them. "Boys, this is Miss Newell," he announced. "She's taking over the cooking. Anyone who complains about the improvement goes on fence duty for a month." A collective chuckle broke the tension, and the men began taking their places at the tables. Penelope noticed Fred enter last, hanging back slightly as if to give her space to establish herself with the crew. The meal was a success. The stew, rich and flavorful after simmering all afternoon, disappeared rapidly, as did the corn bread and cobbler. Several of the hands made a point of thanking Penelope directly, their genuine appreciation evident in the clean plates and requests for seconds. As the men were finishing, the door opened again to admit a tall, broad-shouldered man with gray streaked dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. The conversations around the tables immediately quieted as he entered. "Sam," Mackenzie greeted him, rising from his seat. "Good timing. This here's Miss Newell, our new cook." Sam Butler surveyed the room, noting the empty serving dishes and contented expressions of his men. "Seems like you've already made an impression, Miss Newell," he observed, his voice deep but not unkind. "My wife mentioned we had a new addition to the staff." "Thank you, Mr. Butler," Penelope replied, suddenly nervous again in the presence of the ranch owner. "I hope the meal was satisfactory." "Judging by these empty plates, more than satisfactory." He turned to Mackenzie. "And the new hand you mentioned," Mackenzie nodded toward Fred, who stood up. "Frederick James, sir, appreciate the opportunity." Sam Butler studied Fred with the same assessing gaze his wife had used earlier. "Wyoming, Mackenzie tells me?" "Yes, sir, bar X for the past 2 seasons." "Good outfit," Butler acknowledged. "We'll talk more tomorrow. For now, enjoy your supper." He turned back to Penelope. "Miss Newell, my wife speaks highly of you already. That's not something she does lightly." With that, he nodded to the room in general and departed, leaving Penelope with the distinct impression she had passed some sort of test. As the men began clearing out after the meal, Fred lingered, waiting until most had left before approaching the serving counter where Penelope was already beginning to clean up. "Seems you made a good impression," he observed quietly. Penelope smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "The bar was apparently set very low," she replied. "But yes, I think it went well." "You'll be all right here," Fred said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Butlers seem like good people." "Thanks to you," Penelope said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been in that store yesterday." Fred looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You'd have found another way. You're stronger than you know." Before she could respond, Mackenzie called from the doorway, "James. Cards in the bunkhouse if you're interested." Fred nodded to him, then turned back to Penelope. "Get some rest. You've had a long couple of days." "You too," she replied, "and Fred, thank you for everything." He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then followed Mackenzie out, leaving Penelope to finish cleaning her new kitchen. Later, in the small room that was now hers, Penelope lay on the narrow but comfortable bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling for the night. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without fear, her last thoughts drifting to the quiet cowboy who had changed the course of her life with a simple act of decency. In the weeks that followed, both Penelope and Fred settled into life at the Diamond Bar. Penelope's cooking quickly became legendary among the ranch hands, who showed their appreciation with impeccable manners in her dining room and an unspoken protective attitude toward their new cook. Fred proved his worth just as quickly, demonstrating a natural way with horses and cattle that earned the respect of even the most senior hands. He worked hard, spoke little, and kept mostly to himself during free time, though he was unfailingly polite when drawn into conversation. Their paths crossed regularly but briefly at mealtimes, or occasionally when Fred was assigned to chores around the main ranch buildings. Each time, there was a moment of recognition, a shared nod or smile that acknowledged their unique connection, but neither sought to extend these encounters beyond propriety. Margaret Butler observed this dynamic with interest, but said nothing, though she had taken Penelope under her wing in small ways, inviting her to Sunday dinners at the main house, lending her books from the Butler library, and gradually drawing out more of the young woman's story. It was during one such Sunday dinner, about a month after their arrival, that news came from Wickenburg. "Heard something in town yesterday you should know about," Sam Butler said, addressing Penelope as they sat around the dining table. "Thomas Norton's been asking questions about the Diamond Bar. Specifically about our new cook." Penelope's hand froze halfway to her water glass. "He's looking for me," Sam nodded grimly. "Apparently he's convinced himself you were stolen from him, been making noise about it in the saloons. Has he threatened to come here?" Fred asked, his voice carefully neutral. As a trusted hand, he had been included in these Sunday dinners after the first couple of weeks. Not directly, Sam replied, but he's been asking about our routines, how many men we keep at the main ranch, that sort of thing. He wouldn't dare, Margaret said firmly. Not even Thomas Norton would be fool enough to cause trouble on Diamond Bar land. Probably not, Sam agreed. But I've doubled the night watch just in case, and I want everyone to be alert. Penelope's face had gone pale. I'm sorry to bring trouble to your door, Mr. Butler. Nonsense, Sam dismissed her concern with a wave. Norton's the trouble, not you, and I protect what's mine: land, cattle, and people. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Penelope remained distracted throughout the remainder of the meal. As they were finishing dessert, Margaret noticed her discomfort. Penny, dear, would you help me gather some herbs from the kitchen garden? She suggested, providing an excuse for them to step outside. In the fading evening light, they walked to the small, fenced garden behind the main house. Once they were alone among the neat rows of herbs and vegetables, Margaret spoke gently. You're worried about Norton. It wasn't a question, but Penelope nodded anyway. I know his temper, if he's been drinking and gets it in his head to come here. She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Margaret placed a weathered hand on Penelope's arm. Child, listen to me, you are safe here. Sam meant what he said. No one causes trouble on Diamond Bar land without answering to him, and beyond that. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I've seen how Frederick James looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. Penelope's head snapped up, her cheeks flushing. Mrs. Butler, I assure you, oh, I'm not suggesting anything improper has occurred, Margaret said with a small smile. Quite the contrary. The man keeps a respectful distance. But make no mistake, he'd step between you and danger without hesitation. He's already done that once, Penelope admitted softly, and would again, Margaret confirmed. As would any man on this ranch. You've earned their respect, Penny, not just with your cooking but with your quiet strength. Penelope blinked back unexpected tears. I don't feel very strong most days. Strength isn't about feeling strong, Margaret said wisely. It's about continuing forward despite your fear. You've done that admirably. As they gathered the herbs Margaret had come for, Penelope found herself thinking about Fred, about the quiet way he checked on her without being obvious, the extra firewood that mysteriously appeared by her door on cold mornings, and the way his eyes softened when she smiled at him across the dining room. She had been so focused on building her new independence that she hadn't allowed herself to examine these feelings too closely. Now, with Margaret's gentle observation, she couldn't avoid the truth: something was growing between them, as delicate and tentative as a spring seedling. Back at the main house, Fred and Sam were deep in conversation on the porch, their voices too low to overhear as the women approached. They fell silent as Penelope and Margaret rejoined them. It's getting late, Sam observed, looking at the darkening sky. Frederick, would you see Miss Newell safely back to the cookhouse? Of course, sir, Fred agreed, standing immediately. As they walked across the ranch yard, a comfortable silence settled between them. The evening was beautiful, stars beginning to appear overhead, a cool breeze carrying the scent of pine from the distant hills, and the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Are you worried? Fred asked, finally breaking the silence. About Norton. Penelope considered the question seriously before answering. Less than I would have been a month ago, but yes, I know what he's capable of when his pride is hurt. Fred nodded, his expression thoughtful. Butler's taking it seriously. Extra men on watch, rotating patrols. No one gets near the main buildings without being seen. It seems like so much trouble just for me, Penelope said, guilt edging her voice. It's not just for you, Fred corrected her. It's for what's right. No man worth the name stands by while another threatens a woman. They had reached the cookhouse door, and Penelope turned to face him. In the deepening twilight, his features were softened, the usual guardedness in his eyes less evident. Fred, she said hesitantly, Mrs. Butler said something earlier that made me think. He waited, patient as always, giving her time to find her words. Is there? She faltered, then tried again. Since coming here, I've started to feel things I thought Thomas had beaten out of me for good: hope, self-worth." She paused, gathering courage. "And something else when I'm with you." Fred's expression remained steady, but something flickered in his eyes: surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Penelope," he said softly, using her full name as he always did, "you've been through hell. You're just starting to find your footing." "I wouldn't presume to. I'm not asking you to presume anything," she interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. "I'm just acknowledging something that seems to be happening between us." For a moment he was still as stone. Then, with deliberate care, he removed his hat, holding it in his hands between them like a barrier. "I'd be lying if I said I felt nothing," he admitted, his voice low. "But you deserve time, space, freedom to choose without feeling obligated because of how we met." His consideration nearly undid her. After years with Thomas, who had taken and demanded as his right, Fred's careful respect for her autonomy was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding, for giving me that time." He nodded once, then settled his hat back on his head. "Get some rest, Penelope. I'll be close by tonight." With that promise lingering between them, he waited until she was safely inside before turning back toward the bunkhouses. Penelope watched through the window as his tall figure disappeared into the darkness, her heart beating with a mixture of fear and something sweeter that she wasn't yet ready to name. The night passed without incident, as did the next several days. Life on the ranch continued its rhythmic pace: early breakfasts, men heading out to work the herds, noon dinner for those nearby, evening meals filled with tired but satisfied cowboys. Penelope threw herself into her work with renewed energy, experimenting with recipes and taking pride in the appreciation shown by the ranch hands. Each day she felt a little stronger, a little more confident in her new life. Fred, true to his word, maintained a respectful distance while remaining a steady presence. Their interactions remained brief, but increasingly comfortable: a shared joke at breakfast, a moment of conversation while he helped carry supplies to the cookhouse, a quiet good night at the end of each day. Almost 2 months had passed since their arrival at the Diamond Bar when the confrontation they had been half expecting finally came. It began as an ordinary Saturday evening. Most of the hands were at the main ranch, having returned from a week of moving cattle to summer pastures. Penelope had prepared a special meal to celebrate their return: roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and 3 different pies for dessert. The dining room was full, the atmosphere jovial, with men sharing stories of the week's work. Fred sat at one of the long tables, occasionally glancing toward the kitchen where Penelope moved efficiently between stove and serving counter. The first indication of trouble came when one of the younger hands burst through the door, his face flushed with alarm. "Riders coming," he announced breathlessly. 6 men, armed, moving fast from the south road. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into activity. Sam Butler, who had been dining with the men that evening, immediately took charge. "Mackenzie, get 4 men and come with me. The rest of you spread out, but stay within sight of each other." His voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "Frederick, you stay here with Miss Newell." Fred nodded, already moving toward the kitchen where Penelope stood frozen, her face drained of color. "Thomas," she whispered as Fred approached. "Likely," he confirmed, his voice low. "But he won't get near you, I promise." Outside, they could hear the thunder of approaching horses, followed by shouts as Sam Butler and his men intercepted the riders at the edge of the ranch yard. Fred positioned himself in front of Penelope, guiding her back into the kitchen while the remaining hands formed a protective semicircle around the cookhouse door. Through the window, they could see Sam Butler facing a group of men on horseback, his stance relaxed but alert. At the front of the group sat Thomas Norton, his face flushed even from this distance, gesturing angrily as he spoke words they couldn't hear. "I need to see," Penelope said suddenly, moving toward the door. Fred blocked her path. "Stay inside, Butler's handling it." "No," she met his eyes firmly. "I've been hiding from Thomas for 2 months. I won't hide anymore." Something in her determined expression must have convinced him, for after a moment's hesitation, Fred nodded, "All right, but I stay with you." Together, they stepped out onto the cookhouse porch. The confrontation was happening about 50 yards away, but the evening air carried voices clearly across the distance. "My wife, and I've come to take her home," Thomas was saying, his words slightly slurred. "This isn't your business, Butler." "Anyone causing trouble on my land is my business," Sam replied evenly. "And the lady in question isn't your wife anymore. Nevada judge granted her divorce 2 weeks ago." This was news to Penelope, who gasped softly beside Fred. Margaret Butler had helped her file the papers, but she hadn't known the divorce had been finalized. Thomas's face contorted with rage. "Papers signed by some judge don't change what's mine." "The law says different," Sam countered. "Now I'm asking you and your friends to leave peacefully." "You're all carrying firearms on private property, and I don't recall inviting you." Thomas's eyes suddenly fixed on the cookhouse porch, where Penelope stood with Fred slightly in front of her. "There she is. Penny, tell these men you're coming home with me." All eyes turned toward them. Penelope felt a moment of paralyzing fear, the old instinct to submit nearly overwhelming her. Then she felt Fred's solid presence beside her, not controlling or commanding, just supporting, drawing herself up. Penelope spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I'm not coming with you, Thomas. Not now, not ever. This is my home now." Thomas's face darkened further. "You ungrateful," he spurred his horse forward, but immediately found his path blocked by Mackenzie and 2 other hands. "That's far enough," Mackenzie warned, his hand resting openly on his pistol. "You're outnumbered, Norton," Sam added, "and outmatched. Take your men and go while you still can." For a tense moment, it seemed Thomas might push the confrontation further. But a quick assessment of the situation, the determined stance of the Diamond Bar men, the rifles that had appeared in several hands, and the clear resolve in his former wife's face, apparently convinced him of the futility. "This isn't over," he snarled, yanking his horse's head around. "You'll regret this, all of you," as he wheeled his mount, his eyes locked with Fred's across the distance. Recognition flared in Thomas's face. "You," he spat. "The interfering bastard from the store, you stole my wife." Fred didn't respond, his expression impassive, but he shifted slightly to ensure he remained between Thomas and Penelope. With a final curse, Thomas kicked his horse into motion, leading his companions in a retreat down the road they had come. Sam Butler and his men watched until they disappeared from sight before returning to the ranch yard. "They're gone," Sam announced, approaching the cookhouse. "For now, at least, but we'll keep extra watches tonight just in case." Penelope was trembling, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her weak-kneed now that danger had passed. "Thank you," she managed. "All of you." "No thanks needed," Sam replied. "No one threatens one of ours. The simple inclusion warmed Penelope more than any elaborate reassurance could have. "Is it true?" she asked. "About the divorce," Sam nodded. "Papers came yesterday. Margaret was going to tell you tomorrow after church." He glanced at Fred, who still stood protectively close to Penelope. "Frederick, why don't you take Miss Newell for a walk? I think she could use some air after all this excitement." It was a graceful exit, allowing them privacy while maintaining propriety, and both recognized it as such. "Thank you, Mr. Butler," Fred acknowledged. "We won't go far." As the men dispersed, and normal activity resumed around the ranch, Fred led Penelope toward a small rise behind the cookhouse. The spot offered a clear view of the surrounding countryside while remaining within sight of the main buildings. They sat on a fallen log, watching as the last light faded from the western sky and stars began to appear overhead. For a long time, neither spoke, content to share the peaceful moment after the tension of the confrontation. "I didn't run," Penelope finally said, wonder in her voice. "When I saw him, I was terrified, but I didn't run or hide." "No, you didn't," Fred agreed, pride evident in his tone. "You stood your ground." "Because you were there," she added softly. Fred shook his head. I was beside you, not holding you up. That strength came from within you, Penelope. It was always there. She considered this, then smiled slightly. Perhaps, but it helps to know someone believes in that strength. They fell silent again, the night sounds of the ranch surrounding them, distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of a horse, the soft murmur of men's voices from the bunkhouses. "I'm divorced," Penelope said eventually, testing the words. "Truly free," Fred nodded. "A new beginning." "Yes." She turned slightly to face him, her expression earnest in the fading light. "Fred, do you remember what you said to me that first day, when I told you my husband beat me?" His brow furrowed slightly. "I said you'd heal where no man raises a hand." "And I have," she confirmed. "Here I've started to heal not just my body but my spirit. I've discovered I'm capable of more than I ever thought possible." "You've flourished," Fred agreed. "Everyone sees it." Penelope took a deep breath, gathering courage. "The time you said I needed to find my footing, to be sure of my own mind, I've had that now. 2 months of standing on my own, making my own decisions, being valued for my work rather than for belonging to someone." Fred watched her face intently, something like hope flickering in his eyes, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "And what have you decided?" he asked quietly. "That independence doesn't have to mean being alone," she replied. "That there's a difference between being possessed and being cherished. That there are good men in this world, and you, Frederick James, are one of the best of them." She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away if he chose, and placed her hand lightly on his. "If you still feel what I think you do, I'd like to see what might grow between us. Slowly, properly, with both of us walking forward together rather than one leading the other." For a moment, Fred didn't move, his eyes searching hers as if to assure himself of her certainty. Then, with infinite gentleness, he turned his hand beneath hers until their palms met, fingers interlacing. "I'd like that very much," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been half in love with you since I saw you stand up to Norton in the store, and falling deeper every day since." A smile spread across Penelope's face, radiant in the starlight. "You have. How could I not?" he asked simply. "Your courage, your kindness, your determination to build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed, it's extraordinary, Penelope." "As is your patience," she responded. "Any other man might have pressed his advantage, knowing what I owed him." Fred's expression grew serious. "You owe me nothing. What I did, any decent man would have done." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but you didn't just rescue me and move on. You made sure I had a safe place, a new start. And then you stayed nearby, protecting without smothering, caring without demanding." She squeezed his hand gently. "That's why I know this is real, not gratitude or obligation, but something that's grown naturally between us over these past weeks." Fred's answering smile transformed his usually serious face, making him look younger, almost boyish. "So we court properly then? Sunday walks after church, chaperoned visits on the porch," Penelope laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the night air. "Yes, though I suspect our chaperones will be quite understanding. Mrs. Butler has been dropping hints for weeks." "Has she now?" Fred chuckled. "Sam, too, in his way, asked me just yesterday about my long-term plans." Their shared laughter felt like yet another barrier falling away between them. When it faded, they sat in comfortable silence, hands still joined, watching the stars brighten overhead. "May I call on you tomorrow, then?" Fred asked formally, though his eyes twinkled. "After church." "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," Penelope replied, matching his tone but unable to hide her smile. As if by mutual agreement, they rose and began walking back toward the main buildings. At the cookhouse door, Fred paused. "I should get back to the bunkhouse," he said reluctantly. "Extra watches tonight," Penelope nodded. "Will you be safe if Thomas comes back?" "He won't," Fred assured her. "Not tonight, at least. Men like Norton talk big, but they rarely follow through, especially against superior numbers. Still, we'll be vigilant." He hesitated, then slowly raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Penelope." "Good night, Fred," she replied, her voice soft with wonder at this simple, respectful gesture that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her. She watched him walk away, his tall figure soon disappearing into the darkness before entering the cookhouse. Inside, she moved through her evening routine banking the stove, preparing things for tomorrow's breakfast, straightening the already tidy kitchen with a lightness in her step that had nothing to do with the confrontation's outcome and everything to do with what had followed. That night, Penelope slept more peacefully than she had in years. The weight of fear finally lifted completely from her shoulders. She was free, truly free, not just from Thomas, but from the shadow he had cast over her life. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect Arizona Sunday. After serving breakfast to the hands, Penelope changed into her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Margaret had helped her make for the weekly church service in town. As the Diamond Bar wagon prepared to depart for Wickenburg's small church, Fred approached, freshly shaved and wearing his good shirt. "Room for one more?" he asked Mrs. Butler, who was already seated beside her husband on the wagon's front seat. "Of course," Margaret replied, her eyes twinkling as she noted the way Fred and Penelope exchanged smiles. Plenty of room. The church service was uneventful, though Penelope received several curious glances from townsfolk who had heard rumors about Thomas's confrontation at the Diamond Bar. She held her head high, drawing strength from the presence of the butlers beside her and Fred in the pew behind. Afterward, as promised, Fred asked formally if he might escort her on a walk. With Margaret's smiling permission, they strolled through the small town and out to a nearby meadow where wildflowers were beginning to bloom. It was the first of many such Sundays. Throughout the summer and into the fall, their courtship progressed with proper decorum but genuine growing affection. Weekdays were filled with work, Penelope in her kitchen, Fred with the cattle, but evenings often found them sharing brief conversations on the cookhouse porch, and Sundays were devoted to longer walks and talks. They learned each other's stories: Fred's childhood in Missouri, the grandmother who had raised him with quiet strength after his parents' deaths from influenza, his years drifting from ranch to ranch across the West. Penelope spoke of her own childhood in Prescott, her parents' early deaths, the strict aunt who had viewed her as a burden until Thomas offered marriage. Gradually, the shadow of Thomas Norton faded from their lives. He made no further appearances at the Diamond Bar, though occasionally word reached them of his continued bitter complaints in the saloons of Wickenburg. Eventually, even those ceased when he left the territory altogether, reportedly heading for California after losing his land to gambling debts. As winter approached, Fred was promoted to assistant foreman when Bill Mackenzie suffered a broken leg that would take months to heal properly. The new position came with a small cabin of his own, separate from the bunkhouse, a fact that did not go unnoticed by anyone on the ranch, least of all Penelope. It was on a crisp November evening, as they sat beside the fire in the butler's parlor after Sunday dinner, that Fred finally spoke of the future. "I've been saving," he said quietly, when the butlers had tactfully excused themselves to check on something in the kitchen. Penelope looked up from her mending, a question in her eyes. "Every month since I started here," he continued. "Sam pays fair wages and I don't have much to spend it on." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "The Larson place is for sale, small spread just north of here. 100 acres, decent house, some outbuildings that need work." Penelope's hands stilled, her heart suddenly racing. "Is that so?" Fred nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Sam says he'd help me stock it, start with 50 head, build from there. It's good land, water year-round from the creek, enough grazing for twice that many cattle." "It sounds wonderful," Penelope said softly, understanding where this conversation was heading but allowing him to proceed at his own pace. Fred set aside the bridle he'd been mending and leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I've never had a place of my own, always been working someone else's land, riding for someone else's brand, never minded it before, but lately—" He took a deep breath. "Lately I've been thinking about roots." A home? Have you? Penelope's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. I've been carrying this for 2 weeks now, waiting for the right moment. With hands that weren't quite steady, he passed it to her. Penelope unwrapped it carefully to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl nestled in its center. It was my grandmother's, Fred explained. Only thing of value I own besides my saddle and guns. Tears filled Penelope's eyes as she looked up at him. Fred. I know we haven't known each other that long, he said quickly. And if you need more time, I understand, but I love you, Penelope. Have for months now, and if you could see your way to becoming my wife, to building something together on that land. Yes, she interrupted, her voice strong and clear despite the tears now spilling down her cheeks. Yes, Frederick James, I will marry you. For a moment, he seemed stunned by her immediate acceptance. Then a smile broke across his face, not the small, reserved smile she was accustomed to, but a wide, unguarded grin that transformed him completely. You will, he asked, as if needing confirmation. I will, she repeated firmly. I love you too, you know, have for quite some time. Fred moved from his chair to kneel beside her, taking the ring and slipping it onto her finger with reverent care. It fits, he observed, a note of wonder in his voice. Perfect, Penelope agreed, looking at the pearl gleaming softly in the firelight. Then she did something she had been wanting to do for months. She leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but tender, a promise of the life they would build together. When they separated, Fred's eyes were shining with an emotion that made Penelope's heart swell. A discreet cough from the doorway announced the butler's return. They entered bearing a tray with coffee and pie, though their knowing smiles suggested they had been aware of what was transpiring in their absence. Seems congratulations might be in order. Sam inquired, his eyes twinkling as he noted Penelope's tear-streaked face and the ring now adorning her hand. Yes, sir, Fred confirmed, rising to his feet but keeping Penelope's hand in his. Miss Newell has agreed to become Mrs. James. Wonderful news. Margaret exclaimed, setting down the tray to embrace Penelope warmly. Though not entirely unexpected, I must say. When are you thinking? Sam asked, shaking Fred's hand firmly. Spring, Fred replied, glancing at Penelope for confirmation. If the Larson place sells by then. Give us time to make it ready. No need to wait on that account, Sam declared. I've already spoken to Larson. Papers will be ready next week. Fred stared at his employer in surprise. Sir, Sam chuckled. Been obvious which way the wind was blowing for months, son. Figured I'd save you some negotiating time. Penelope laughed at Fred's dumbfounded expression. It seems our courtship hasn't been as discreet as we thought. Hardly, Margaret agreed with a smile. The entire ranch has been placing bets on when Frederick would finally speak up. This revelation brought laughter from all of them, breaking any remaining tension. As they settled with their coffee and pie, conversation turned to practical matters: the wedding plans, improvements needed at the Larson place before spring, and how Penelope would need to train a replacement cook for the Diamond Bar. Later that night, as Fred walked Penelope back to the cookhouse under a canopy of stars, their future seemed to stretch before them as vast and promising as the Arizona sky. Are you happy? He asked, his arm around her shoulders to ward off the November chill. Happier than I ever thought possible, she replied honestly. A year ago, I couldn't imagine a life beyond each day's survival. Now I'm planning a wedding, a home, a future. Fred's arm tightened slightly. You'll never have cause to fear again, Penelope, I swear it. She stopped, turning to face him in the moonlight. I know that, Fred. Not because you're promising to protect me, though I know you would with your life, but because you've shown me how to be strong on my own. That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. He studied her face, love and pride mingling in his expression. You did the hard part yourself, standing up to Norton, rebuilding your life here, facing down your fears. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but it helps to have someone who believes in you. Who sees not just who you are, but who you could be. Fred smiled, reaching up to touch her cheek gently. "I see a remarkable woman who's going to make an excellent rancher's wife, and perhaps, someday, mother to a whole brood of stubborn little Jameses." Penelope laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the night air. "How many is a brood exactly?" "As many as you want," he replied. "Our home will have room for plenty." The image warmed her, a house filled with children, with laughter, with love freely given and received. It was so far from the life she had lived with Thomas that it almost seemed like a dream. But the solid presence of Fred beside her, the weight of his grandmother's ring on her finger, and the tangible plans they were making all assured her this was real. This was her future, hard-won and precious. At the cookhouse door, they shared another brief, tender kiss before parting for the night. As Penelope watched Fred walk back toward his cabin, she felt a sense of completeness that had eluded her all her life. She had found not just safety, but belonging. Not just independence, but partnership. Not just escape from cruelty, but the promise of enduring kindness. The winter passed in a flurry of preparations. While continuing their duties at the Diamond Bar, Fred and Penelope spent every available moment readying their future home. The Larson place needed considerable work, repairs to the roof, a new cook stove, fencing for the closer pastures, but with help from their friends at the ranch, the small house gradually transformed into a home. Margaret helped Penelope sew curtains and quilts, while Sam and the hands assisted Fred with the heavier repairs. By February, the main house was habitable, and they began moving their few possessions in preparation for the spring wedding. They were married on the first Sunday in April, 1884, in the same small church in Wickenburg where they had attended services throughout their courtship. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by the entire Diamond Bar crew and many townspeople who had come to know and respect the couple. Penelope wore a gown of cream-colored silk that Margaret had helped her make, with sprigs of wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Fred, looking almost uncomfortable in his new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle on Sam Butler's arm. "Who gives this woman in marriage?" the minister asked. "She gives herself," Sam replied with a smile, "but her friends at the Diamond Bar stand with her." The answer, a departure from tradition, had been Penelope's idea, an acknowledgement that she came to this marriage as her own person, not as someone's property being transferred. Fred had understood and approved completely. Their vows were traditional but spoken with deep conviction, each word a promise neither intended to break. When Fred slipped the gold band alongside his grandmother's ring on Penelope's finger, his hands were steady and sure. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The kiss that followed was brief but heartfelt, met with enthusiastic applause from their friends and neighbors. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Frederick James, Penelope felt a sense of rightness that brought tears to her eyes. The celebration afterward, held at the Diamond Bar, lasted well into the evening. There was food and music, dancing and laughter, and many heartfelt wishes for their happiness. It was late when they finally departed for their own home, driving a wagon loaded with wedding gifts along the moonlit trail to the small ranch that was now officially James' land. As Fred helped her down from the wagon in front of their house, Penelope paused to take in the sight their home, with lamplight glowing from windows that now held curtains she had sewn. Smoke rising gently from the chimney where one of the hands had built a fire earlier to warm the house for their arrival. "Welcome home, Mrs. James," Fred said softly, his arm around her waist. "It's perfect," she whispered, leaning into him. "Everything I never dared to dream of." Fred's kiss was more passionate than those they had shared during their courtship, unrestrained now by the propriety that had governed their relationship until this moment. Penelope responded with equal fervor, all the love she had been carefully containing now free to express itself fully. When they finally parted, both breathless, Fred swept her into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their home. Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Penelope rested her head on Fred's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Happy?" he asked, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. "Beyond words," she replied truthfully. "You, more than I thought possible." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I never expected to find this a home, a wife, a future worth building. Spent too many years just drifting." Penelope propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the dim light filtering through the curtains. "And now," his smile was tender as he reached up to trace the curve of her cheek. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere but here with you." "Nor I with you," she whispered, lowering her head to kiss him again. The years that followed fulfilled the promise of that first night together. The James Ranch prospered under their joint care. Fred's knowledge of cattle, and the land complemented by Penelope's practical management of their household and finances. Their original 50 head grew to over 200 within 3 years, allowing them to purchase adjacent land when it became available. Their family grew as well. Their first child, a son they named Samuel after their friend and mentor, was born just 10 months after their wedding. A daughter, Margaret, followed 2 years later, and another son, William, 2 years after that. Through it all, they maintained their close friendship with the Butlers, who became honorary grandparents to their children. Sunday dinners at either the Diamond Bar or the James Ranch became a tradition, with the older couple delighting in watching the family they had helped create flourish. Penelope never saw Thomas Norton again. Word reached them occasionally of his whereabouts: San Francisco for a time, then reportedly Alaska during the gold rush. Eventually, the news stopped coming altogether, and with it, the last tenuous connection to her previous life was severed. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their now expanded home watching their children play in the yard, Penelope reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You ever think about that day in Forrester's store?" she asked Fred, who was seated beside her, his hand comfortably entwined with hers. "Sometimes," he admitted, "though it seems like another lifetime now." "It was," she agreed. "I was a different person then." Fred squeezed her hand gently. "Not entirely." The strength was always there, just waiting for the right circumstances to show itself. Penelope smiled, watching as 9-year-old Sam taught 5-year-old William how to throw a rope, while 7-year-old Margaret supervised with all the authority her young age could muster. "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but I needed someone to believe that strength existed before I could believe it myself." Fred's eyes followed hers to their children. "They have your strength," he observed. "Especially Margaret, stubborn as they come," Penelope laughed. "She comes by it honestly from both sides." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the peaceful evening and each other's company. The ranch spread out before them, fields green with spring growth, cattle grazing on distant hillsides, the small orchard they had planted now beginning to bear fruit. "Did I ever thank you?" Penelope asked suddenly. "Properly, I mean, for what you did that day." Fred looked at her, his face weathered now by years of working their land, but his eyes still holding the same steady kindness that had first drawn her to him. "You thank me every day," he replied simply. "By being exactly who you are, by building this life with me." He gestured toward their children. "By giving me them." Tears pricked at Penelope's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming fullness of her heart. "I love you, Frederick James, more now than the day I married you, and I didn't think that was possible then." "And I love you," he returned, leaning over to kiss her softly. "More with each passing day." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Penelope thought about the words that had changed the course of her life a decade earlier. "My husband beat me," she had confessed, broken and afraid. "Then you'll heal where no man raises a hand," he had promised. It was a promise kept not just by Fred, but by Penelope herself. She had healed, grown, flourished. The frightened woman who had stumbled into Forrester's general store that day was gone. replaced by someone stronger, happier, and more complete than she had ever imagined possible. In finding the courage to leave, she had found herself. In reaching for help, she had discovered her own strength. And in trusting Fred, she had found not just safety, but a love that continued to deepen with each passing year. As night fell and they called their children in for supper, Penelope knew with absolute certainty that this home, this family, this life built on mutual respect and genuine love was what she had been meant for all along. The path had been difficult, even dangerous at times, but every step had led her here to a place where hands were raised only in blessing, never in anger. To a home filled with laughter instead of fear. To a life not just of survival but of joy, and for that she would be forever grateful.